Welcome to Grassroot Ohio, conversations with everyday people working on important issues here in Columbus and all around Ohio. I'm Carolyn Harding, and today I'm talking with Justin Nobel, writer on science and environment for U.S. magazines, investigative sites, and literary journals. Justin Nobel's work has been published in Best American Science and Nature Writing and Best American Travel Writing, a book he co-wrote with the death row exonoree, The Story of Dan Bright, was published in 2016 by University of New Orleans Press. His 2020 RollingStone magazine story, America's Radioactive Secret, won an award for long-form writing with the National Association of Science Writers and inspired his soon-to-be-released book, Petroleum 238, Big Oil's Dangerous Secret and the Grassroots Fight to Stop It. Justin's writing has helped lead to lawsuits, public dialogue, and been taught at Harvard School of Public Health. Welcome to Grassroot Ohio, Justin.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. It looks like you're coming to Ohio in May and early June 2024 to present your new book, again, Petroleum 238, Big Oil's Dangerous Secret and the Grassroots Fight to Stop It, which began as an investigation with RollingStone magazine that examined the radioactivity brought to the surface in oil and gas production and the various pathways of contamination posed to the industry's workers, the public, and communities, and the environment. The book will be published on April 24, 2024. This book is a culmination of about 7 years of investigation in Ohio, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and other oil and gas regions throughout the U.S. and other countries as well, Justin?
Yeah, it focuses mainly on the US, although this is certainly an issue in other countries. And right now I'm working on an investigation regarding oil field waste contamination in the North Sea. So all these countries that brand themselves as very green, like Denmark and the Netherlands, they are actually doing some really concerning things with their oil field waste as well, like just dumping it right in the ocean. But the investigation began in Appalachia. It began in West Virginia and Ohio and Pennsylvania. Like you said, 7 years ago, 2016, 17 is when I first learned about injection wells, actually. And Teresa Mills was one of the early people who helped lead me into that topic, educate me on that topic, along with Dr. Julie Wetherington Rice, and then really a whole network of people across the region. So absolutely, now that the book is coming out, I feel it's really important to come back to one of the main well springs of knowledge in this book, which is Eastern Ohio and Central Ohio, Northern West Virginia, and all across Pennsylvania, and give talks and do events. And there's some really exciting events that you all have helped me plan, so thank you.
Well, yes. Your title heads off with Petroleum 238. And most people want to know what that is. What is Petroleum 238?
Right. So petroleum has been running our world, whether we like it or not, for about a century now. And that just refers to fossil fuels, oil that we draw out of the ground. 238 is referencing radio, like a different, what we call a radionuclide. A radionuclide is a form or isotope of a radioactive element, and one of the main ones of concern when it comes to oil and gas waste is uranium-238. Uranium-238 is, if you imagine a decay chain, kind of like a family tree, and at the top you'll have an element like uranium-238. And being a radioactive element, uranium-238 will do what radioactive elements do, which is every so often it's going to fire up a piece of itself. That's called radiation. And having lost a piece of itself, it's literally become another element. And that element may also be radioactive. And that element at some given time is going to fire off a piece of itself, more radiation shot out. You don't want to be near it when that happens. And it's become yet another element. And it goes on through firing off pieces of radiation, becoming new elements. Uranium-238 238 is particularly notable because it's at the top of the decay chain. It's what we're starting with. And so petroleum 238 is just a riff off of that.
I see. Well, let's talk about Ohio and the Appalachia region that includes West Virginia and Pennsylvania. That region, in your article in 2020, you stated that it has 1/3 of the US natural gas. Is that still true?
Yeah, maybe even as high as 40% now. I think if you include the two main oil and gas formations in the area, that would be the Marcellus and the Utica. And so, yeah, that is pretty astonishing. We're up against Texas, North Dakota, Alaska, all over the country. There's major oil and gas deposits in the U.S. The U.S. is actually a really rich nation when it comes to oil and gas. If you want to, think of it as an asset. Then we can use a word like rich. There's a lot of it here, but Appalachia, and in particular, that little core area you mentioned, right where Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania come together, is just absolutely loaded. Under the surface, you don't see it unless it's being extracted with natural gas. It's a huge play. Oil and gas formations are often referred to as plays, and it's huge. It's on par with some of the big formations in Saudi Arabia and the Middle East. Not as large as some of them, but up there with some of the world's major gas reserve. And for the U.S., it's really significant. And it also happens to be, these formations happen to be some of the more radioactive formations across the country. And all sorts of concerns come up because, as the book lays out, a lot more comes to the surface at an oil and gas well than just the oil and gas.
Like what? What does come up besides the oil and gas?
So the primary waste stream the industry produces is a really toxic liquid that they often refer to as produced water or oil field brine. These are relatively innocent sounding names, but produced water, brine, can be filled with, first, just toxic levels of salt. And brine spills in Ohio, going back into the 40s and 50s across the land, have still left that land contaminated. This is really biblical. You can't spill high levels of salt across farmland and expect it to grow. You salt someone's land, you destroy it. So the salt alone in brine is a problem, but there's also heavy metals. There's carcinogenic compounds like benzene. This can be a concern for workers. And then there's also radioactive heavy metals. Heavy metals are things like lead and arsenic. And then we go a little bit further down the periodic table, we get to things that are metals, but they're radioactive metals. And radium is a very concerning radioactive metal that can be highly elevated in brine. And the problem is industry produces a massive amount of it. So just to give you an example, across the country, the US produces 3 billion gallons of brine a day. This is a toxic wastewater that's coming up to the surface. You go to a wellhead and you look at tanks. If there's oil, there's going to be a tank for oil. And then if you look at the other tanks, one of them is going to say brine. It's stored there initially in a tank at the wellhead. And then in the east, often trucks will have to take it to disposal sites called injection wells. Those are problematic. And really every step of the way, there's huge problems. And the problems are there, for one, because this waste stream is dangerous, and secondly, because the industry has never appropriately dealt with it. So early on, they just dump produced water into unlined pits, into streams and creeks. This is why you still have contamination in places like Ohio and also North Dakota, all across the country. Now, much of this produced water, brine, is taken to injection wells. But the book really lays out that injection wells are an entirely inappropriate means of disposal. And really, there's no scientific merit backing injection wells, which I think is going to come as a big shock to a lot of people. And the underground injection control program is regulated by the US EPA. You apply for formal permits, and the EPA likes to think that they're doing a good job of controlling the system. But documents the book lays out point out that early on, EPA had no faith in injection wells to appropriately contain this waste stream. They never thought it was a good idea. Industry did not think it was a good idea. And there's no science backing this idea that you can dump endless truckloads of fracking waste under the earth, which is porous and filled with cracks, and think it's just going to stay there.
Well, in central Ohio, there's not a lot of oil wells or gas wells, but there are several. There's 13 active injection wells within the Columbus Metro watershed, and that pales to in comparison to what's going along on down in Athens and along the Ohio River as far as injection of this toxic waste. So what is this dangerous secret of this toxic waste?
So for one, the radium alone in produced water ends up being very problematic. Radium is a radioactive element that we know a bit about because it's contaminated humans in the past. There's the famous case of the radium girls, uh, often women, artists who had this cool job, what seemed like a cool job, painting the hands and dials of watches and clocks with a radioactive paint. The problem is there was the radioactivity, in this case was radium. Radium, when it gave off radiation, excited zinc molecules, which caused this paint to glow. So how fun, right? But the women would use the paintbrush and to keep the tip firm, wet it in their mouth, a process called tipping, and over time ingested, small little amounts of the paint, but it ended up being enough that many of them died from horrible cancers. And that's because radium is regarded by the medical community as a bone-seeking radioactive element. It tends to accumulate in the bones. Again, we go back to the periodic table. The chemical nature of radium is very similar to calcium, so your body ends up taking it in as if it were calcium. And that's a horrible place for a radioactive element to be. Now, this is the same radioactive element and the same isotopes that are in the brine. The concentrations are much less than in the paint, but processes of the oil and gas industry actually end up concentrating the radium in really concerning ways. And then you are getting towards the level that these women were dealing with in some instances. So what happens is the industry knows that people in Ohio don't like injection wells. They're now focused on trying to treat the produced water, treat the brine, and that involves trying to remove the contaminants, and then they can reuse the water and maybe do something with the sludge or salt that they pull out of that stream. But if you just think about it, logically, if you have a really gunky, contaminated waste stream, and there's a lot of it, and you remove the bad stuff, you've now concentrated that bad stuff. So you've actually made an even more dangerous problem, because what are you going to do with that? What are you going to do with all this radioactive sludge that you've pulled out of the brine? And the industry, unfortunately, never answered that question, never even really tried to answer it. And so now you have these fracking waste treatment plants or produced water treatment plants all across Ohio, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and they brand themselves as something very green and beneficial for the industry, that they're cleaning the waste. What they're really doing is contaminating workers. From head to toe and from inside out as well, because these workers are not informed of radiation dangers. They are not wearing appropriate PPE. And so you end up with a frightening situation where they're working in what is legitimately a radioactive, contaminated environment. There's tons of dust in the air because there's all this salt being pulled out of the brine. It's very dusty, no respirator, breathing it in, sludge all over the bodies, all over their clothes, which will often be washed maybe in a hotel laundry room or at home with their family's clothes. And now we know, because I've spent quite a lot of time probing this pathway, workers are coming out and they are getting sick. And in one instance, we've learned that 2 workers at a plant in northern West Virginia that was doing just this, trying to treat the brine, have passed away from cancer, one from stomach cancer and one from brain cancer. So part of what the book does is really start to put the pieces of all this together. And also, I think, give the public health community and the activist community and just general communities ability to take these questions further. And I think the next step will really be to look at these workers and start to put together just how many workers have gotten sick by this, because it's certainly more than just those 2 I mentioned.
This is Carolyn Harding with Grassroots Ohio, and today I'm talking with Justin Nobel. He has just written a landmark book called Petroleum 238, Big Oil's Dangerous Secret and the Grassroots Fight to Stop It. Let's talk about these workers. You spent a great deal of time interviewing them in your Rolling Stone article. Talk about some of these folk that you have met and why you're so driven to getting their stories out.
Yeah, it's a great question, Carolyn. If you're wanting to learn about the industry, you can read reports and you can go to communities where the industry is operating right in their presence and get pretty close to it. But the people closest to it, actually in it, are the workers. And often they're going to be uninterested in speaking. That's normal. They're doing a job. They can, in some cases, be making really good money, and there's not many economic opportunities in some of these communities. So they're excited about that job. They don't want to forfeit it. But they also, in the back of their head, things have tallied up at work that have made them worried. They've realized that these treatment plants, which are often branded as, like I said, these wonderful environmentally friendly things, they get fouled up regularly. They get gunked up. And then there's instances where workers will maybe one day see a radioactivity symbol on a container and be like, what's that doing there, boss? And their boss will say, like, never ask me about that again, or you'll be fired. I mean, things like this regularly happen. So they start to gain knowledge. Maybe they forget about it again. And then maybe they see something that I published or someone else published on the issue, and they do more research, and then they get legitimately concerned. And so through, a lot of effort, a lot of good work of people in communities making connections to workers, some of the best worker contacts that I've been able to connect with have been from community groups that have been very concerned about a facility, and they publicize it and they try to rally around it. And eventually a worker will reach out to them and say, hey, you're right. And I actually know that it's even worse than what you're saying. And then eventually that group can connect me to the worker. And through that process, I've been able to find a whole number of courageous workers who are willing to really share what is happening at these plants. And unfortunately, it's just incredibly sloppy. I mean, that's what really blows my mind. This industry brands itself as very sophisticated, as wealthy, as you see the commercials on TV, and it seems like they're saving the world at the same time giving us energy, and it's all great. When you get down to it, their waste is being handled in an abominable manner, and their workers are being put in absolutely atrocious conditions. One thing the book lays out at a facility in Ohio, Austin Master Services, this is another plant dealing with oil field waste. There was actually a practice, and there's other workers point out that this was happening at other locations too, other facilities, practice of drawing workers who have just been released from prison. They're desperate for work, and they get a job here, and it seems great. They get a job right away. You're in a vulnerable situation is the problem. They're not informed about risks, and they're also not protected. And in many instances, according to workers I've spoken to who work there, these workers are on drugs. They stay on drugs. It's one of the reasons they like this job. They can keep doing drugs. They don't have to get drug tested. But now you're dealing with a nightmare situation. I mean, you're dealing with unprotected workers on drugs shoveling around radioactive waste. It's a disaster.
What are the direct paths of exposure? Is these folks that work in these recycling of oil filled waste, but there are other folks that work in the industry. Are they at risk as well? Like the brine haulers and the people that are, spreading the brine on roads. It's legal some places, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Brine spreading still happens in Ohio. Because again of fantastic activism of a number of different people and groups, has Ohio regulators, I think, are much more skeptical now of this process than they were maybe 5 or 10 years ago. The practice of spreading brine, which again is oil field waste with an elevated radium concentration on public roads. Once you know a little bit about the science, it seems outrageous that would even be greenlit. But the issue in the Northeast and Midwest is one of the major costs for small communities, especially, is keeping dust down on dirt roads in summer and snow and ice removal in winter. It's a significant cost. Salt costs a lot of money. De-icing costs a lot of money. Keeping your roads clear is a big thing for small communities. And again, you've got to give it to the oil and gas industry for how devious they are here. They came in and said, we've got a free product, so take that cost and just cross it off your balance sheet. We're going to give you this for free. And that looks pretty good. The problem is, though, it has elevated levels of heavy metal and radium. So, but a really good question on exposure. So who's at risk? Well, any scientist that I have spoken to who works in the field of toxicology, epidemiology, environmental hazards, radiation. They regard the practice of dumping radium-rich fluids onto dusty public roadways as outrageous. No one has told me that that is appropriate or something that should be done. But you're spreading it in relatively a diffuse manner. I'm not at all saying this practice is okay. And this is a big scientific question now. Where does that radium go once it's dumped out onto the roads? And there's some really good research being done at, for example, Dr. Bill Burgos's lab at Penn State, trying to answer that exact question. You know, does it stick to the clay on the surface of the road? Does it run off into the ditches? How does it move through the environment? It is moving through the environment. It's not disappearing, but we're still figuring that out. But there's a risk. You're adding elevated radioactivity to an environment, and there is natural radioactivity, of course, across the earth, but you're raising that. You're intentionally raising that, and we never want to intentionally raise it if we can help it. But certainly more at risk are the workers who are up against forms of waste that have much higher concentrations. So then again, we're talking about the sludge. So if you think of a brine truck spreading brine, absolutely a concern. But who would be most at risk? Well, that brine truck. Again, brine has a lot of sediments, right? So the sediments are going to be settling out of the brine truck. There's going to be a sludge at the bottom. Any tank or truck that holds brine, just like you let your coffee cup sit for long enough, there'll be a sludge at the bottom. Some human will have to clean that sludge out. And that is really the most significant risk. That person, if they are not appropriately protected, and in my experience, they absolutely aren't, they're at a much more significant risk than someone walking along a road. That person still has a risk. It's elevated. It's not normal day. We've now changed things, but it's not as significant as the worker who's much more intimately in contact with more concentrated forms.
So why doesn't OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or other regulatory agencies like the EPA protect workers from this radioactive exposure?
This would be a great place for people to activate on. I think one of the most powerful documents I lay out in the entire book, I save for the way end, and it is from a Louisiana environmental regulator. Amazingly, in this era when it seems like the regulators are constantly in cahoots with the industry, are really trying to help them, and the people trying to hold them accountable we seem like crazy people. How dare we try and protect the environment and make it a little bit more difficult for this industry to basically just operate safely. But that's the vibe now. But there's one really strong example that went against that, and that's a Louisiana regulator back in the late 1980s. He was head of the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality. It's a major position in a huge oil and gas state. He had a PhD, and he was a genius. And what he did, instead of closing his eyes to this issue, he learned that there was radioactivity in oil field waste, again, from an organizer in the community. And instead of ignoring it, he said, I want to study it. And I want to look at it because I want to know how bad this problem is. So instead of, always playing catch up, which is what's happening now in Ohio, he tried to get ahead of it. And he sent teams out. So, for example, they did things like they studied oysters in places where produced water was being discharged into estuary. Oysters are a major revenue and food source in Louisiana. And they found indeed that the radioactive element radium was accumulating in oysters to levels that were quite concerning. And this was a huge issue in Louisiana, especially. And he was able to pass regulation that helped stop the discharge of produced water directly into the coastal zone. Which of course it never should be done, but that still was a significant piece of legislation and cost the industry quite a lot of money, and they fought that vigorously. And he also sent a letter to OSHA, and this letter, Carolyn, is astonishing because it lays out, everything that we now know, everything that my reporting has dug up. It's like, oh, he knew about this 30 years ago, and he put it very neatly and crisply in a letter to OSHA. So this is a letter to OSHA coming in like 1989, I think, from the head regulator of one of America's most important oil field states, right? And he laid out all the problems, and he really pressed the worker risks and the community health risks. He said, these are concerns. I am worried that what I have found is happening in Louisiana is happening across the country, and OSHA did absolutely nothing, and they have done nothing on this issue. So I think this is a really, they are capable of doing something, and I think people pestering them and writing letters and bugging them on this issue will help make that a reality. But right now, OSHA's been, negligent. I mean, they get an F on this.
Well, let's talk about exemptions, because state legislators and regulators have given the industry a lot of exemptions. In fact, Teresa Mills quoted in your article, legislators have laid out a careful set of exemptions that allow this industry to exist. And there is no protection for citizens at all. Nothing. That's Teresa Mills. So the state legislators are in cahoots with the industry.
Yeah, and thank you for reading that. It's one of my favorite quotes, and I love Teresa for some people will say something that's really extreme, seems extreme, and then think, oh, I'm being a little bit too aggressive. I'm gonna like walk the end of the quote back, and Teresa, no, she'll say it and then she'll like reinforce it. So thank you for that, Teresa. And we're thinking of you here. Yeah. So, and what I really want to do, I really think the book allows people to take that exact quote, and you now can hold this up to these legislators. So, okay, yeah, I get it. You want to exemptions make business cheaper, but look at what you've done. This waste, which is exempted, and I'll get into exactly how it happened. It's now covering this human being's face. Okay. That's real. That's something real. This isn't, and you can say it's not hazardous by the laws that you have crafted and exempted. You can say that, but science is differently, and it's all over their face, and they're breathing it in 12 hours a day, 6 or 7 days a week. And the radium doesn't care about your little exemption. And that's the problem here. Their exemptions are not in line with the laws of science. And that's what leads to, cancer is dictated by science and not by, whatever we can come up in state houses. So the Queen exemption is an exemption to a piece of legislation in the late 1970s called the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA for short, RCRA. It was a good-natured attempt to deal with the nation's industrial waste crisis. And being in Ohio, this started right there with you all. The Cuyahoga River caught fire, right? And it was actually like the 13th time the river caught fire. So this finally sent a message, we can't just chuck all the worst waste into rivers. We've polluted these really significant waterways. We've got to do something better with it. And RCRA was part of the reaction to that, to try and do something more appropriate with the nation's industrial hazardous waste. The problem was, to do that, you had to figure out, well, what waste is hazardous and what is not hazardous. And a lot of money was resting on that decision. And the oil and gas industry was able to get an enormous exemption that declared that all of their waste, no matter how radioactive, no matter how toxic, it, by the letter of federal US law, is non-hazardous. And that has massive ramifications, and also specifically for these workers who end up covered with that waste.
Justin, real quick, before we have to wrap up, where can people get more information about you and about your book?
Yeah, the book, Petroleum 238, Big Oil's Dangerous Secret and the Grassroots Fight to Stop It. I have a blog on Blogger, which you all hopefully will have a little link to, or someone will. And that has all the events. And we're doing great events in the Ohio area and in the West Virginia, Pennsylvania area in general. So I would say go to your local bookstore if you haven't already, and try and ensure that they carry it. If not, at least pre-order it. A bookstore doesn't have to carry a book to just pre-order. And the book is, any bookstore should be able to. It's distributed through Ingram, which is the major distributor for all bookstores. So yeah, just give them the title, my name. They should be able to pre-order it for you, so it's ready for you on the 24th. And if they can carry it and do an event, and if it's in an area where I don't already have an event, let me know, because I definitely want to get to as many communities in Ohio as possible with this.
Justin, thank you so much for joining us today. And you'll be in Columbus, Ohio on June 2, because we are holding an event called Frack Stock with Justin Nobel. And it will have live music, good food, and you'll find those links on Grassroot Ohio.
And that's a really fun one. So yeah, thank you for that, Carolyn. Thank you for having me here today.
Thank you so much, Justin. You've been listening to Grassroot Ohio podcast with Justin Nobel, writer on science and environment for U.S. magazines, investigative sites, literary journals, and the groundbreaking new book, Petroleum 238, Big Oil's Dangerous Secret, and the Grassroots Fight to Stop It. In addition to our Friday 5 p.m. broadcast on WGRN LP-FM, Grassroot Ohio airs on Sundays at 2 p.m. on WCRS-FM. And you can find us on SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. Thanks for joining us.